A right forearm ends just below the elbow, not torn away in the accident that caused it, healed. The bone at the stump is smooth and rounded, resurfaced by the kind of slow biological repair that only happens over years, not days. The skull nearby carries a healed depression fracture across the left eye socket, a blow hard enough to have likely blinded that eye long before death. The joints show arthritis advanced enough to have made walking on uneven ground genuinely difficult. The ear canals carry bony growths consistent with significant hearing loss. This is Shanidar 1, a Neanderthal man excavated from a cave in northern Iraq in 1957. He was missing a hand and most of a forearm. He was likely blind in one eye. He probably could not hear well. His joints had degenerated to the point that fast movement across rock and scree would have been agonizing. When he died, he was somewhere in his 40s, maybe younger. Researchers still argue over exactly how old, but by any measure old for a Neanderthal, in an Ice Age landscape where average adult lifespan rarely stretched much past 30. He could not have hunted. He could not have outrun a predator. He may not have been able to hear one coming. For years, possibly a decade or more, based on how completely those bones had remodeled themselves, he lived anyway. If this is already landing, subscribe and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. So here's the actual question, the one that matters more than the details of his injuries. What did a mobile foraging band, chasing herds across a frozen landscape, hunting to eat, moving camp every few weeks, actually do when one of its own could no longer hunt, walk fast, or chew properly? The assumption most people carry into this question, often without examining it, is that ancient life left no room for mercy, that the Ice Age was too hard, too lean, too dangerous for a group to slow down and drag along someone who could not contribute. Survival of the fittest, understood loosely, gets read as survival of the useful, and everyone else gets left behind. Shanidar 1 says otherwise, and he is not alone. Archaeologists working with a method called the bioarchaeology of care, developed largely by researcher Lorna Tilley, have identified a growing list of Paleolithic skeletons that tell a similar story. A serious injury or degenerative condition, followed by years of continued life that the condition alone should not have allowed. The method works something like reading wear patterns on a stone tool to figure out how it was used. Bone remodels itself constantly. A fracture that killed someone quickly looks different under analysis than one that healed and kept healing for years. Tilley's framework walks through the pathology, estimates the resulting disability, and asks a blunt question: could this person have survived alone, or did survival require someone else's help? For Shanidar 1, the answer isn't close. Consider the case that, strangely, helped build the wrong idea of Neanderthals in the first place. In 1908, two French priests excavating a rock shelter at La Chapelle-aux-Saints uncovered a Neanderthal skeleton that came to be called simply the Old Man. He had lost nearly all of his teeth, most of them long before death. The jawbone healed over and resorbed around the empty sockets. His spine and hip joints carried degenerative disease, severe enough to bend his posture and limit his mobility. When the paleontologist Marceline Boule reconstructed the skeleton for publication, he read the stooped spine and read it wrong, describing a hunched, ape-like gait that helped cement the brutish caveman image that stuck in the public imagination for decades. Boule had mistaken one old man's arthritis for the physical template of an entire species. But look at what that arthritis actually required. A person with no teeth left cannot eat raw meat off a bone or crack open nuts. Food had to be prepared for him, likely softened, possibly pre-chewed by someone else, for what was almost certainly years. The fossil that helped invent the myth of the brutish Neanderthal is, read correctly, evidence of the opposite. Someone kept an old, toothless, arthritic man fed long after he had anything physical left to offer the group. This pattern is not the default setting for social mammals. Watch a wild chimpanzee community long enough, and you'll see what usually happens when an individual becomes seriously disabled. Researchers who have followed chimp populations for decades, including the long-running studies at Gombe, have documented individuals with paralysis or severe injury declining rapidly, sometimes within weeks, with little evidence of sustained provisioning from the rest of the group. Chimps will occasionally share food or tolerate a disabled member nearby, but the kind of committed, years-long investment written into Shanidar 1's bones, or the old man's jaw, has no clear equivalent among our closest living relatives. That gap is the real finding here. Somewhere in the 6 million years since our lineage split from theirs, the balance tipped. Care that required real, ongoing cost became something hominin groups were willing to pay for, again and again, across different sites and different time periods. There's also a reason old age itself needs explaining in a species like ours. Female humans are one of the few mammals on Earth that routinely survive decades past the end of their reproductive years. Most mammals die at roughly the same time their fertility does. Ours don't, and anthropologist Kristen Hawkes has spent decades building a case for why. Working with the Hadza, a foraging population in Tanzania, Hawkes and her colleagues documented something concrete. Grandmothers who were done bearing children were still out gathering food every day, and the calories they brought back tracked closely with how well their weaned grandchildren were fed. A woman who could no longer have children of her own was still functioning as one of the most important food sources for children who were not hers to raise alone. The grandmother hypothesis argues that this pattern, repeated over enormous stretches of time, is part of why human females evolved to live so long past menopause in the first place. Age in this framework is not simply the accumulation of wear. It's a second career. If this video is giving you something to think about, subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep making content like this. That's the setup and the first 3 pieces of evidence. Let me know when you're ready and I'll continue with part 2, covering what happened when care wasn't possible, what it actually cost a group to keep someone alive, and how this all comes back around to Shanidar 1. Even after decades of study, some Neanderthal injuries remain genuinely contested. Take the debate directly to Shanidar 1 himself for a moment, because it matters here. Researchers still disagree on exactly how his arm was lost. Some read the truncated bone as evidence of a deliberate amputation, a level of medical intervention that would itself be extraordinary for the period. Others argue for a crush injury, a rock fall, or an accident during a hunt gone wrong, followed by infection that the body eventually walled off on its own. What isn't contested is what came after. Whichever way the injury happened, the healing that followed took years, and years of healing in a body that could no longer feed or protect itself is not something bone does in isolation. This kind of disagreement is worth sitting with rather than smoothing over, because the picture of Paleolithic compassion has a real skeptical counterweight in the research literature, and a channel that only tells the flattering half of the story isn't telling the whole one. Paleoanthropologist David DeGusta examined a different fossil entirely, a Homo erectus skull found in Kenya, known as KNMER 1808, a woman whose bones show a bizarre overgrowth condition called hypervitaminosis A, likely from eating too much predator liver, a disease that would have left her in serious pain for weeks before death. Earlier researchers had pointed to her as another clear case of group care keeping a dying woman alive. DeGusta pushed back. He argued that a few weeks of survival, even in obvious pain, doesn't require nursing in the way a decade of survival with no forearm does. Sick animals across the natural world sometimes linger near a group without anyone actively feeding them. The line between being tolerated and being cared for is real, and it isn't always easy to find in a fossil. That distinction turns out to be the actual finding, more interesting than a simple yes or no. Care, when it shows up in the Paleolithic record, is not a constant hum running under every hominin group at every moment. It shows up in specific, extreme, unmistakable cases, the ones like Shanidar 1 and the Old Man of La Chapelle, where the disability was severe enough and the survival long enough that no other explanation fits. Between those unmistakable cases and ordinary tolerance, there's a wide gray zone the bones simply can't resolve. And the gray zone gets darker at its far edge, because care had a real physical cost, and cost is the thing that makes any of this a meaningful evolutionary question, rather than a nice story. A mobile foraging band moving after game herds across an Ice Age landscape did not have surplus stored in a barn somewhere. Every extra mouthfed was calories pulled directly from someone else's body. Every person who had to be carried, or waited for, or walked beside at a slower pace was a drag on a group's ability to reach the next kill site before a rival predator did, or outrun a change in weather. Anthropologists Kim Hill and Magdalena Hurtado, who spent years living with and studying the Ache people of eastern Paraguay, documented something that doesn't fit neatly into either the compassionate ancestor story or the brutal ancestor story. In their long-term fieldwork, they recorded cases where elderly or severely incapacitated group members were, in a minority of documented situations and typically only under extreme, immediate survival pressure, left behind or not actively sustained. It wasn't the norm. It wasn't casual. It was what happened at the outer limit, when keeping one person alive threatened to take the whole group down with them. That's an uncomfortable fact to put next to Shanidar 1, but it's the fact that makes his case mean something. He lived in a landscape where a group could and sometimes did choose differently. His survival for a decade or more, with a missing forearm, a ruined eye, failing hearing, and joints that made travel a genuine ordeal, was not the automatic output of a species wired for softness. It was a choice, repeated daily, made by people who had every practical reason available to make a different one. If this video is giving you something to think about, subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep making content like this. So here's the reframe. It's tempting to file all of this under kindness, to imagine a Neanderthal band as a Stone Age charity keeping a disabled man alive out of pure feeling. That framing is comforting, and it's also probably backwards. Care wasn't bolted onto survival as something separate and nobler than it. Care was survival run through a different set of people. Hawks's grandmothers weren't being generous when they gathered extra tubers for grandchildren who weren't theirs to raise. They were running the same energetic economy that fed the hunters, just from a different position in it. The people who kept a toothless old man chewing something soft enough to eat weren't performing an act of mercy set apart from the group's practical needs. They were doing what groups that outlast other groups do. Somewhere in the deep stretch of hominin evolution, the math changed. A group that could absorb the cost of an injured hunter, an infertile elder, a blind adult, started outcompeting groups that couldn't. Not because feelings evolved first and behavior followed, because the behavior worked, and the feelings that make the behavior feel automatic came along for the ride. Go back to that forearm one more time, the one this all started with. It isn't dramatic to look at, just a stump, smoothly capped, unremarkable at a glance to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. But sit with what it actually represents. Somewhere around 50,000 years ago, in a cave in the Zagros Mountains, a group of people who had every reason to move on without him instead spent years making sure a one-handed, half-blind, hard-of-hearing man had food in his mouth and a place by the fire. Not because they'd read a treatise on ethics, because keeping him alive was, in some deep and practical sense, what their kind of animal had learned to do. The weak and the old weren't a burden ancient humans tolerated in spite of the odds. They were proof the odds had already changed. Thank you for watching. More videos are on your screen now, and if you haven't already, subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.